Hi everyone, it's John, and I want to show you even more of my university press books that come from my library. There are many of them. These are ones that I'm just pulling off. Hopefully I think they're a pretty good representative sample of my interests and my tastes. And I'm just choosing some of the ones that I think people might find most interesting if you like books like this. If university press books and scholarly books more generally bore you, of course, all of these will bore you, but if they ever interest you and you generally like the humanities, the social sciences, literature, literary history, art, philosophy, and peripheral subjects, hopefully you'll find something in here that you like. So here are 10 more books from my library that are published by university presses. This first one is a book of literary critical essays by Hayden White. It's called The Content of the Form, Narrative Discourse and Historical Representation. This is put out by Johns Hopkins. And the back says, Hayden White probes the notion of authority in art and literature and examines the problems of meaning, its production, distribution, and consumption in different historical epochs. In the end, he suggests the only meaning that history can have is the kind that a narrative imagination gives to it. The secret of the process by which consciousness invests history with meaning resides in, quote, the content of the form, the way in which our narrative capacities transform the present into a fulfillment of a past from which we wish to have descended. From which we would wish to have descended. Oddly phrased last sentence. That's a pretty good summary, I guess. Without having read most of the essays in the book, I can tell you that Hayden White was largely concerned before he died a few years ago. Narrativity, representation in literature, what a narrative is and how a narrative functions and how narratives create meaning. And I don't necessarily mean narratives in works of fiction. I mean narratives in works of history. So how you tell a history of a particular event, whether it be the Battle of Agincourt or World War II, affects the meaning that it communicates to readers and the meaning that readers get from it. It's a bit on the theoretical side, but it's fascinating. And along the same lines, let me get you my other. Yes, so there's another Hayden White book in this sack, and I thought I would show them together. This is Tropics of Discourse, Essays in Cultural Criticism. Hayden White's Meta-History, which is another book of his that I have but is not in this stack, has become a text central to all discussions on the nature of historical writing. In Tropics of Discourse, White continues his exploration of the relationship between history and other literary forms. Tropics of Discourse develops White's ideas on interpretation in history, on the relationship between history and the novel, and on history and historicism. Vico, Croce, Derrida, and Foucault are among the figures he assesses in this work, which also offers original interpretations of a number of literary themes, including the wild man and the noble savage. White's commentary ranges from a reappraisal of Enlightenment history to a reflective summary of the current state of literary criticism. Here is a book bought from the erstwhile Borders. This is The Romantic Imperative by Friedrich C. Beiser, the concept of early German Romanticism. And if anyone out there happens to be familiar with early German Romanticism, Friedrich C. Beiser is probably one of the big names that you associate with work in that area. I think he teaches at the University of Syracuse. And this was put out by Harvard University. The early Romantics met resistance from artists and academics alike, in part because they deified the conventional wisdom that philosophy and the arts must be kept separate. Indeed, as the literary component of Romanticism has been studied and celebrated in recent years, its philosophical aspect has receded from view. This book, by one of the most respected scholars of the Romantic era, offers an explanation of Romanticism that not only restores but enhances understanding of the movement's origins, developments, aims, and accomplishments, and of its continuing relevance. I have a couple of other books by Beiser. One is a huge 600 or 700 page synthesis of German Romanticism, which I have not read. But I got really into German Romanticism with the first semester of a 2-semester class on 19th century German philosophy, which I took in school. Had a fascinating teacher. The first semester was all of the Romantics, and then the second semester was mostly Marx and Freud. But also interesting, semester number 2, but this one was more so. This does not have a blurb anywhere, but people will probably recognize it if you do a lot of syllabus browsing like I do, especially graduate syllabus browsing. This is Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare by Stephen Greenblatt. I think everyone knows who Stephen Greenblatt is. That's the guy who wrote The Swerve, on De Rerum Natura by Lucretius, wasn't it? This is put out by the University of Chicago, and it's a series of 6 essays, relatively long essays actually, that were published in 1980, just when formalism in literary criticism was starting to be pushed to the side in favor of new criticism and historicism. And this is sort of one of those early works that lets us see what a whole new body of sort of literary criticism will look like, applied to, in this case, early modern English language literature, 16th and 17th centuries. This is a book by a historian I have many, many books by. I think you would pronounce his name as Georges Duby. He is French, so that should give you this explains why the S is on the end of Georges. The last name I'm not exactly clear on, but it's called The Age of the Cathedrals, Art and Society from 980 to 1420. And the blurb on the back is very short, mercifully short. Although individuals create works of art, these works are also the product of a particular time and place. In The Age of the Cathedrals, French historian Georges Duby offers a sweeping survey of the changing mentalities of the Middle Ages, as these changes are reflected in the art and architecture of the period. The result is a richly textured portrait of another age and a provocative essay on the relationship between art and society. And this one was published, I think, in 1976. This is, I believe, an abridgment of a work that was originally much longer. I'll have to look that up. I think the original is much longer than this, but this is another one of those books. If you're interested in print or book culture from the early modern times, this is The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe by Elizabeth Eisenstein. This is put out by Canto, but it's from Cambridge. I'll read you the back. While the importance of the advent of printing for Western civilization has long been recognized, it was Professor Eisenstein in her monumental 2-volume work, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, who first provided the comprehensive treatment of the subject. This illustrated and abridged edition, there you go, gives a stimulating survey of the communications revolution of the 15th century. It begins with a discussion of the general implications of the introduction of printing, and then explores how the shift from script to print entered into the 3 major movements of the early modern times: the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of modern science. Throughout, Eisenstein illustrates vividly the main startling effects of printing on Western intellectual thought. I saw this for next to nothing online. I love these Canto editions. They're beautifully made. But I think sometime I might just want to go for the original long edition. Even though this shorter version still comes in at around 300 pages. Okay, this is volume 3. I think I have volume either 1 or 2 somewhere in a box. This is by Quentin Skinner. It is called Visions of Politics, Volume 3, Hobbes and Civil Science. It is basically a collection of his essays on Thomas Hobbes, mostly informed by Hobbes's Leviathan, but not strictly. Of course, Hobbes wrote scads and scads of books and pamphlets. And he is a Hobbes scholar, but also a scholar of early modern political science and political theory. The third of 3 volumes of essays by Quentin Skinner, one of the world's leading historians. This collection includes some of the most important essays on Thomas Hobbes, each of which has been carefully revised for the publication in this form. With his customary perspicuity, Professor Skinner examines the evolution and character of Hobbes' political thought, concentrating on his theory of the state. An indispensable work in its own right, this volume also serves as a demonstration of the methodological principles propounded in Volume 1, and as an appositional commentary on the Renaissance values of civic virtue treated in Volume 2. All of Professor Skinner's work is characterized by philosophical power, extensive learning, and elegance of exposition. I didn't think we would be getting so much PR on the back of a Cambridge book, but it is essays on the political theory of Thomas Hobbes. Next one, another book that I will mercifully has no blurb, and I will not try to explain to you. And I never maybe even when I read it, I may not even then try to explain it to you. This is Freud and Philosophy by someone I've tried to reconcile myself to in the past. This Freud and Philosophy, an essay on interpretation by Paul Ricoeur. It is basically his book-long, 550-page long critique of Freudian psychoanalysis. For those unfamiliar with Ricoeur, he was a very, very well-known French philosopher of the latter decades of the 20th century, and somewhat difficult to understand, but by no means as difficult as some other 20th century philosophers. So I should still keep pounding away and trying to, like I said, reconcile myself with him and learn more about him. 2 more to go. These are the most recent books I bought in this stack of 10. This is Renaissance Thought and Its Sources by Paul Oscar Christeller. Christeller was one of the historians who brought the study of the Renaissance to the United States and basically revived it. Before him, there were not many professors of Renaissance studies in the United States. People either studied ancient Greek and Roman history, medieval history, or early modern history. But the Renaissance is sort of in that liminal stage. I mean, despite the fact it being, full of important artists and philosophers and thought and culture and you name it, he is kind of credited for, in the early part of the 20th century, bringing all of that back to the United States. Representing an extraordinary lifetime of scholarship, Renaissance Thought and Its Sources offers a systematic account of major themes in Renaissance philosophy, science, and literature. Here, in some of Paul Oscar Christeller's most comprehensive and ambitious writings, is an exploration of the distinctive trends and concepts of the Renaissance, grounded in detailed historical investigation. Originally delivered as lectures, the 14 essays collected in this volume range from examination of the classical and medieval roots of the Renaissance to a discussion of such broad concepts of the period as the dignity of man, the immortality of the soul, and the unity of truth. Christeller achieves throughout the book a graceful trend of severe historical scholarship and adherence to humane values, which editor Michael Mooney calls nearly a lost art in our times. Christeller was the Frederick J.E. Woodbridge Professor Emeritus at the University of Columbia University and taught philosophy there, even though he was not really known as a philosopher, but more of an intellectual historian specializing in the Renaissance. And one more book by Christeller. This is Renaissance Thought and the Arts. And the back says, written by an eminent authority on the Renaissance, this collection of classic essays deals not only with Paul Christeller's specialty, Renaissance humanism and philosophy, but also with Renaissance theories of art. The essay focuses on topics such as humanist learning, humanist moral thought, the diffusion of humanism, Platonism, music, and learning during the early Renaissance, and the modern system of arts in relation to the Renaissance. For this volume, the author has written a new preface, a new essay, and an afterword. And this was put out by Princeton. So there are 10 new books. Not new, but new to you, I guess, from university presses. If any of them look interesting, or if you've read any of them, give me your thoughts below, or else I will see you next weekend. Bye.